The Nintendo Entertainment System introduced the world to some of gaming's most iconic characters that are still getting new games to this day. We've got Italian plumbers, we've got Hylian warriors, hell, we've even got intergalactic bounty hunters. So it's not too far-fetched for Nintendo to also throw in Pit, a skinny white boy with wings. Finally, some representation. Kid Icarus was definitely a bit more of a curveball when compared to some of the other titles on the NES. I mean, it's not too out there or anything, but the worlds that Nintendo had created up to that point tended to be much more based in their own fantasies. You know, Mario and the Mushroom Kingdom, Samus and Zebes, Link and Hyrule, Kirby and Dreamland, all original ideas. And while Pit lives in the fantasy world of Angel Land, it's heavily inspired by Greek mythology. Over the course of its games, you are bound to recognise some of the characters, or at least their names. Hades, Poseidon and Medusa are all names that would be concerning to see in a Mario title, but in a game that's based around gods and angels, yeah, I'll allow that. The Kid Icarus series spans over 36 years, and a huge variety of 3 games. The last one being from a decade ago. What happened here? The general premise of the series was really unique, and to be honest, so was the gameplay. Well, to figure that one out, we really need to take a look at the games, and how they evolved over time. So let's take a look back to 1986. Initially, Kid Icarus only had one staff member, Toru Osawa, who wanted to create an action game with some RPG elements. He was already a fan of Greek mythology, so hey, his debut game seems like as good a time as any, I guess. Osawa created everything that an external development company, known as Intelligent Systems, would then use to create a prototype of the game. During this time, Nintendo had actually been creating Metroid, and once that was finished, more staff members were available for the Kid Icarus project. A few other big names joined the project and really started to streamline the whole development process, but at the same time started throwing in more humour into the angelic world. Originally, Osawa envisioned the game to be much more serious, and in theory this makes sense because Greek mythology in general does tend to have this divine and serious atmosphere around it. I mean, different gods, a lot of conflict, and most myths having some sort of moral lesson to take from it. But if I'm being honest, the humour in this series is what makes it so iconic. And taking an actual look at Greek god myths, there was so much f***ing absurd and downright hilarious stuff going on. We're talking about gods being so hungry that they eat themselves. How can we not have a bit of humour? The staff team were under some pretty serious crunch with this game, staying late, sleeping in the office, probably coding the Greek god of coffee, just in the hope that he will come and bless them with some. And honestly, it started to show in the actual game. A lot of ideas had to be dropped because there was simply not enough time to implement them. And in terms of the actual gameplay, well, we'll get to that. The game is weird from the get-go. Most platformers generally want the player to go from left to right, throwing in a few jumps for good measure, but not here. We are having to make our way from the bottom of the stage all the way to the top. The mechanics are honestly pretty unique and interesting. Other than the vertical climb, we can also walk all the way to one side of the screen and come out on the other, which I think was pretty neat for an NES game. We can move from side to side, jump, do a little crouch, and fire arrows from the world's sh**est bow. Seriously, these things do not like the idea of flying through the air. As you climb upwards, everything below you disappears. Not in the story or anything, just if you happen to fall back down, you're in trouble. Now all of this is fine, but one of my biggest issues with the game, that is generally shared by most people who play it, is that the game is unreasonably difficult. Balls to how long other people say the game is, I'm terrible, so it's going to take that for me to just get past the first handful of stages. The game has this fun little way of absolutely spamming you with enemies, to the point where it's just more annoying than an actual good challenge. This is where I feel some of the time restraints can be seen, because for an intro level to be as hard as this one, I struggle to see how this is playtested thoroughly. Taking a look at another platformer game that only came out 2 years prior to Kid Icarus, Super Mario Bros., its first level was designed exactly how a first level should be designed. It eases the player into the whole idea of what the game is, giving the player space to run, putting a single enemy in your way for you to learn from, a few item boxes, but importantly, it doesn't smother you with having too much going on. Kid Icarus definitely throws way too much at us from the get-go, which really isn't helped by it having absolutely no context or explanations for anything at all. We have 4 of these snake dudes, which are fine, followed by more of them, followed by more of them. Dude, I've jumped up 2 platforms so far, can you calm down please? As we progress through the level, we are introduced to a fair few different enemies with different movement patterns, and eventually we get to this Reaper guy, and my god, I hate this thing so much. It also spawns 4 baby Reapers when you startle him as well, which is fun, I think. If you do get hit a few times like I did, it ends up being practically impossible to get past points like this, because one hit and you're dead. Thankfully, I am playing on the Switch version of the game, which fittingly makes me the god of rewinding games. I honestly would have struggled getting through any of the game at all without the ability to redo mistakes. I know in hindsight it's more obvious, but the game doesn't really explain that this red thing with a line is your health meter, and the hearts you collect are actually more akin to currency, so I was basically just replaying each death on one hit point for most of it. So, well done me. The platforming in this game really felt fun, but it was definitely a challenge in itself at times, especially because if you fell off the screen, you would die. Which does sort of make it weird why they chose to put lots of enemies in places like this to begin with. Certain areas seem kind of perfect for being centered entirely around platforming, while others are great for fighting hordes of enemies, but when combining them both, it can be overwhelming for the most part. In some cases, the game almost felt like it was trying to trick me. Just as I think I'm safe, the floor turns into this f***ing fire demon out of nowhere. I really love a lot of the themes in the game though. It's pretty cool to play as an angel battling your way through the underworld. And my god, the fact that you heal yourself by drinking wine? What a good choice by the developers. We need this in the next Mario title. Overall, the game was pretty unique and had some really cool concepts, but was ultimately held back by its difficulty and general gameplay flaws, which overall were probably due to the time constraints and excessive work hours put on the development team. And sadly, it meant that I really struggled to get far in the game without having to use the Switch cheats. And that's not really that rewarding, so I ended up having to watch a lot of it online instead. But no problems, because this game got its very own sequel. The Game Boy was a new way to play Nintendo games, and a lot of big names got their own games on the system. In 1991, the game Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters hit the scene, and boy, when I tell you that this was a completely different experience from the first game, it's because I'm lying. Of Myths and Monsters was, on the whole, a pretty similar game and experience to the NES game. Its main difference honestly being that it was on a Game Boy now instead of the NES, which gave it portability at the expense of a smaller screen. Other than the plot, most things here stay the same. You can move the same way, it's still a platformer with enemies to shoot with your bow, and you still heal from alcoholism. However, most things that Kid Icarus does, its sequel tends to do better in my eyes. The game controls a lot better, and the enemies feel much more fair. They aren't just being thrown at you constantly from the get-go, and you actually have some breathing room to explore your surroundings. The only thing that this game misses from its predecessor is the screen size. The first game had tons of space to move around, whereas this game feels much more closed in, making the actual platforming in the game a very real threat. Oftentimes, I would feel like I'm making a leap of faith because I can't really see much further than the next platform that I'm jumping to, meaning if any enemies fly my way, I'm gonna get a smack to the face. The game definitely fixes a lot of the issues I personally faced with the NES game, but naturally has its own limitations from being on a small, portable console. At least here we do get a scrolling camera, which really helps to explore these stages with such low visibility. Again, this game felt pretty difficult, even with the changes to how enemies worked. The smaller screen was the main difficulty throughout the game, but overall I'd say it was an improvement without straying too far from what the Kid Icarus series was going for. So, surely, the third entry into the series would be right around the corner to take the best from both of these games and create the ultimate Kid Icarus experience, right? Right? It took over 20 years for a new Kid Icarus game to come out. 20 years! And even then, it was because Sakurai was tasked with making a new 3DS game, looked at some of the characters in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, and thought, yeah, this guy hasn't had a game in a while. The wait between Of Myths and Monsters and what would become Kid Icarus Uprising meant that the original Kid Icarus fans had grown up, many of which might not be too interested in the series, or even in gaming at all at that point. And while this may seem like a bit of a problem when it comes to trying to sell the game, it actually opens a lot of doors. The developers aren't bound to making the same type of game. Hell, in Uprising's case, they didn't even go with the same genre of game. So after 20 years of waiting, let's see what Pit has to say for himself.
Sorry to keep you waiting.
Oh, well, now I just feel bad. Kid Icarus Uprising is a third-person shooter that is divided between two gameplay styles. The first being air battles, which play out like a rail shooter and are definitely my favourite parts of the game, and the second being land battles, which are, well, they're definitely part of the game. The reason I feel so differently about these two gameplay styles are because of the controls, which are by far the single worst thing about Kid Icarus Uprising for the majority of players. In air battles, you will use the circle pad to move Pit around, to dodge attacks from enemies, you'll use the trigger to fire your weapon, and to aim, you'll be using the bottom screen and a stylus, or your finger, or a mouse if you're me. Nobody tell Nintendo please. The land sections are a little bit different though. You still have the circle pad and the trigger buttons to move and shoot, but this time your bottom screen has two functions. As well as using it to aim, you'll also be using it to swipe the camera back and forth, which is just horrible. Trying to piss around with the camera by swiping it mid-fight is genuinely where half of the game's difficulty seems to come from. And overall, since one of your hands has to move around the joystick, push up and down on the trigger, and support the entire system, or controller in my case, while your other hand is doing something completely different, it not only gets a little bit too much to multitask at times, but can lead to a bit of wrist strain after a while of playing. The game originally came with a stand for your DS for this very reason. Sometimes, generally trying to move around in tight areas can be a bit of a nightmare too. The difference between dashing, running, walking, and trudging is so small on one joystick that Pit ends up just jumping to his death sometimes when I'm trying to move an inch.
I never learned how to read!
Aside from the control scheme not really working for the majority of players, the game is actually really good. Gameplay wise, it feels so great when you get the hang of flying around and dodging attacks while shooting back at them. And on the ground, there was a lot more variety in gameplay than I'd initially expected, which kept it really interesting. The game going from a platformer to a third-person shooter feels weirdly right for the series. It still has some platforming-esque elements thrown in, but the main focus is the shooting, which is kinda what you want when the main character uses a bow, or a staff, or a cannon, or whatever else. The game actually has some customization options with weapons. You can combine the two to make something new, or just choose from weapons that you find throughout the game. They each give different stats and a different way to play the game. The wine is gone, so that kinda sucks, but in its place we get all sorts of different food items, and the drink of the gods. All of these heal you and tend to be placed every now and then throughout levels. The story of the game is handled pretty damn well. Instead of playing through a few levels and getting the odd bit of story here and there, Uprising goes a different route and merges the story and dialogue elements into the gameplay. The top screen will handle the gameplay, while the bottom screen almost plays out like a bit of a visual novel, and this is just fantastic. It really stops the story from breaking apart the gameplay too much, while also giving context to what is happening at that very point in the level. Uprising's dialogue and story is 100% its biggest strength in my eyes, because of how genuinely funny it all is. The decision to make the NES game more humorous than serious is absolutely carried on through into Uprising, and takes characters that you'd initially think of as being this serious and divine being, and shows them for the jokes that they really are.
If you have an all-seeing eye, why can't you see Pandora's location?
Because of my slightly botched laser eye surgery.
Are you messing with me again?
The back and forth between characters lets me get to know what their deal is and invests me into the story much more than I would have from one 30-second cutscene. Uprising took everything about the Kid Icarus series and turned it into an amazing experience that both honours the original idea of Kid Icarus, but also takes it to a whole new level of fun. Other than its control problems, which could easily be fixed with a remastered version of the game, Uprising looked like the first step in what could have been a great new direction for the series. But 10 years later, we still haven't really got any official news on a new game for the series. The Nintendo Switch would have been a great new system for a new entry into this franchise. Its control options would hopefully be able to fix the issues that Uprising struggled with, and the popularity of the console means that there is a lot of potential for creating new fans of the series. If I were to be really optimistic, I would even go as far as to say that a new Kid Icarus game could be a launch title on whatever the next Nintendo console is, since that was initially why Uprising was created for the 3DS. But the harsh reality is that these games have historically never sold that well, and probably aren't a priority for Nintendo while so many of their other IPs are thriving. Sakurai has himself stated that he doesn't have any plans to create a sequel for Uprising, nor does he think there will be a modern adaptation for the Switch. However, this is also the franchise that took a little 20-year nap in between their second and third game, so it's entirely possible that at some point in time there will either be a new game similar to Uprising, or maybe even something new entirely. Each game into the Kid Icarus series had glaring issues. The NES game was unforgivingly difficult and often annoying to play. The Game Boy entry was an improvement in some regards, but suffered from things like a small screen. And Uprising was a reimagined Kid Icarus that just so happened to have an unfortunate control scheme. It would be amazing to see a fourth game that fixes these issues while holding on to its strength like the fantastic dialogue, fun fight sequences, and awesome overall story. I'm definitely hopeful that this isn't the last we've seen of Kid Icarus. There are a lot of rumours that a remaster will come to the Switch, but we have to take that with a pinch of salt. Whether it be in 1 year or 10 years, I think it's likely that we could see a new game in the future.